Welcome to this story. Tonight, we'll be sharing the quiet beginnings of one of history's lesser-known, yet deeply entangled truths, the story of the slaves of the Mongol Empire. As the stars settle above the vast steppes and the wind dances gently through the grass, let yourself ease into the night. Let your thoughts drift slowly across time. If you're new here, remember to subscribe for more sleepy stories from forgotten histories, crafted gently for your rest. Now breathe deeply, let your eyes grow heavy, and let the story carry you calmly into sleep. In the early 13th century, as the hooves of Mongol horses thundered across Asia and Europe, the world trembled beneath the rise of a new empire. Born from the scattered tribes of the steppe, Genghis Khan's vision stretched across mountains, rivers, and deserts. With every conquest came wealth, knowledge, and people. Among the spoils of victory were not only gold and livestock, but human beings, men, women, and children taken from their homes, destined for a life of servitude under the vast sky of the Mongol domains. In the beginning, the Mongol clans had no institutional system of slavery. Their culture prized strength, loyalty, and familial bonds. But as they expanded and mingled with sedentary civilizations, especially the Khwarezmians, Chinese, Persians, and Rus, they adopted the practices of their conquered peoples. Soon, the concept of slavery grew not just as a byproduct of war, but as a necessary structure within the empire's military and economic engine. Slaves were not merely prisoners. They were shepherds of the Khan's flocks, grooms to his horses, cooks in his camps, and sometimes even soldiers on the front lines. The Mongol way of war produced captives by the thousands, and rather than waste them, they repurposed them. A peasant boy from the Russian plains might find himself herding sheep in the Gobi Desert. A noble Persian girl might be kept in a tented pavilion, serving an officer's wife or forced to bear the children of a commander. The empire needed hands to support its growing structure, hands that would never be free again. These slaves, though scattered across vast geographies, shared a common fate. They belonged to someone else. Their labor, their time, and often their bodies were no longer their own. The Mongol elite viewed them as instruments useful, necessary, and disposable. Yet despite this, some managed to survive, adapt, and even rise within the ranks, for the Mongols valued talent above birth. A skilled artisan, physician, or strategist might be given better treatment, even granted privileges or informal freedom, though never true autonomy. Within Mongol society, power flowed from loyalty, and if a slave proved valuable enough, they could be rewarded MLDK Dernwi. But these cases were rare. Most slaves remained nameless, faceless, and silent in the pages of history. They were the ones who set up the yurts, fed the warriors, shod the horses, and buried the dead. They lived beneath the roar of histories, great events, whispering their quiet resilience in languages forgotten by time. The system was not uniform. In the eastern provinces near China, slavery took on a more bureaucratic face. Registers, taxes, and decrees defined the status of slave and freeman. In the western steppes, it was informal, ruled by the whim of a master and the power of the sword. Some slaves lived alongside their owners, eating similar food, sleeping under the same roof, though always a step below. Others lived in pits, huts, or tents at the edge of the camp. There were no slave codes or protections, only the Khan's law, and that law was interpreted by those in power. Life for a slave in the Mongol Empire was harsh, unpredictable, and often short. Yet it was not always defined by cruelty. Some masters were indifferent, some kind, others brutal. The experience of slavery varied wildly depending on geography, status, skill, and chance. A healer captured from Tibet might serve in the tent of a general, while a blacksmith from Samarkand might find his skill so valued that he was kept comfortable and safe. Others, taken in war, were worked until they died. The Mongols rarely enslaved their own, but children orphaned by battle or disease might be adopted into the clan as servants. Loyalty to the Khan sometimes earned such adopted children a chance at a new life, though always under the eye of their superiors. The lines between servant, slave, and soldier blurred, especially during the decades of expansion when manpower was everything. But at the heart of it, slavery in the Mongol Empire was utilitarian. It was about function. The Mongols did not romanticize or theologize the practice. They saw it as necessary, efficient, and inevitable in a world ruled by conquest. When they took a city, they divided the population. Artisans and scholars were preserved. Soldiers and rulers were killed. Commoners were enslaved. This system was swift, cold, and effective, and it allowed the empire to keep moving, to feed its armies, to sustain its administration, and to preserve skills it could not afford to lose. Yet in the silence of night, in the cold of the tents, behind the smoke of the cooking fires, the slaves whispered to one another in many tongues. They spoke of homes long lost, of families scattered, of gods who no longer heard their prayers. And yet, somehow, they continued. This is their story. A slow, soft unfolding of lives lived under command, of quiet endurance beneath the shadow of an empire that reshaped the world. You may rest now, knowing your story is being remembered. In the chapters to come, we will journey deeper into the daily life of Mongol slaves, the food they ate, the clothes they wore, the ways they loved and grieved. We will uncover their rituals, their work, their punishments, and their few joys. But for now, breathe softly. Let the winds of the steppe rock you into sleep. As the sun quietly rises over the rolling hills of the Mongol steppe, the wind sweeps gently across the dew-covered grass, stirring the smoke of early morning fires curling from low hearths. In these quiet hours, before the hoofbeats of patrols and the cries of commanders cut the silence, the slaves of the empire awaken to another day of labor, one more sun's journey in a life of routine, repetition, and restraint. The daily life of a Mongol slave began before the Khan's warriors stirred from their felt-lined yurts, long before the first command echoed through the camp. Many would sleep in makeshift shelters on the edge of the encampment, sometimes sharing thin furs, other times curled against animals for warmth in the icy dawn. They were not awakened by gentle voices or comfort, but by obligation and instinct, the memory of punishment, by the fear of failure. The day began with chores as varied as the empire's needs were vast. The Mongol army and its sprawling infrastructure relied upon constant, disciplined logistics. Slaves prepared fires for cooking, gathered dung and brushwood for fuel, and fetched water in heavy skins or clay jars from distant streams. Some were tasked with tending to the herds, yak, sheep, goats, and horses, the very lifeblood of Mongol society. These animals provided milk, meat, leather, and transport, and their care was critical. Slaves walked miles each day to graze and return them, enduring the chill, the dust, and the sharp rebukes of impatient herders. Others worked in domestic roles, assigned to noble households, where they cooked, cleaned, repaired garments, or rocked noble infants in silence. Within the Khan's palatial camp, slaves moved with bowed heads, their eyes lowered, careful not to overstep or draw attention. Every gesture was calculated, every breath measured. Their work was thankless but essential, for even the greatest empire needed someone to boil its soup and saddle its horses. Female slaves, especially those taken from foreign lands, often bore the dual burdens of physical labor and personal service. While some were spared the harshest duties to tend to noble women, their days were long, filled with weaving, sewing, grinding grain with heavy stones, or preparing dairy, the fermented Mare's milk that was a staple in Mongol diets. A few were assigned to care for the tents, known as gairs, which had to be dismantled, packed, transported, and reassembled as the nomadic army moved across the plains. The work was physical, repetitive, and often invisible in the grand tales of war and conquest. Slaves who demonstrated specialized skills were sometimes segregated into workshops or caravans. Craftsmen, blacksmiths, woodworkers, potters, and tanners found themselves working long hours in open-air forges or makeshift ateliers, crafting weapons, tools, and horse gear. These individuals lived under tighter surveillance, but were given slightly more food or better clothing, a quiet acknowledgement of their value. Yet they remained enslaved, unable to control their hours, often laboring until their fingers bled, or their backs bent beyond recovery. In larger Mongol cities, such as Karakorum, slaves maintained roads, cleaned waste from public areas, and carried bricks and timbers for construction. They were sometimes grouped into teams and watched over by Mongol overseers with leather whips, whose tempers flared with little provocation. If a structure failed or if a task lagged, it was the slaves who paid the price beaten, starved, or replaced. The Mongols were practical, not sentimental. A sick or injured slave was more burden than an asset. In military camps, slaves were indispensable. Some managed the supply lines, transporting goods across vast distances in carts pulled by oxen. Others handled the feeding and grooming of war horses, animals revered more than most humans in Mongol eyes. A few unlucky ones were assigned to the grisly task of battlefield cleanup, removing corpses, gathering spoils, or retrieving arrows for reuse. These slaves saw horrors no one spoke of, and their nightmares were silent, swallowed by cold nights and harder mornings. The rhythm of a slave's day was dictated not by clocks or calendars, but by necessity and command. There were no days of rest, no holidays, only the faint hope of kindness or a less cruel master. Meals were sparse scraps of meat, sour curds, old barley, and if lucky, a bone to chew. There were days when hunger gnawed stronger than the wind, and the slaves clung to the smallest comforts. A quiet song from a far-off land, a word in a shared tongue, a smile stolen behind a yurt. For some, the repetition became their refuge. Predictability offered safety. As long as they worked well, didn't speak out, didn't look the wrong person in the eye, they could avoid punishment. And while beatings, mutilation, or even death were common for disobedience or escape attempts, many survived by fading into routine, an invisible thread in the empire's vast tapestry. Some slaves raised children born into this life, little ones taught from birth that their hands were not their own. These children fetched water, gathered firewood, or helped with livestock, knowing nothing else. Occasionally, a master might show favor, especially to a bright child or one born from a concubine. Such favor could lead to better treatment, but never true freedom. The boundaries were clear, even when cloaked in gentler tones. Among the Mongols, hierarchy was everything. Even free commoners bowed to nobles, and slaves stood at the bottom, beneath the horses, beneath the dust. But there was order in that, a cruel symmetry that allowed the empire to function with stunning efficiency. And in the quiet between work and sleep, the slaves dreamed of old homes, of lost families, of rivers and orchards, and things now far behind. They whispered stories in tents after dark, stories of resistance and magic, of gods that might still hear them. These tales were soft rebellions, memories kept alive in the face of erasure. In the story of the Mongol Empire, the slaves remain unnamed, their hands behind every saddle and spoon, their voices hushed. Yet they were there, every day, shaping the empire not with power, but with unyielding presence. And as you rest tonight, know that their story continues. Tomorrow, we will walk through what they wore and how their clothing revealed their rank, their suffering, and their place in a world of leather and wool, silk, and rags. For now, drift gently, held by their quiet legacy. As the winds of the steppe swept softly across the open plains, a pale moon cast its light over the camp, illuminating rows of yurts and the sleeping silhouettes within. Amid the shadows, the slaves lay wrapped in coarse blankets or curled under borrowed furs, their garments thin, patched, and threadbare. In the vast machinery of the Mongol Empire, where ranks were known, where orders flew like arrows, and where silence often meant survival, clothing became more than fabric. It was an unspoken language of power and submission. A Mongol slave's appearance told a quiet tale, not just of their role, but of their origin, suffering, and how the world around them saw them. In the early days of conquest, newly captured slaves would arrive in the clothes of their homeland. Loose Persian tunics, heavy rust coats, silk garments from the Song dynasty, or the woolen robes of the Caucasus. But as they were absorbed into the empire, these garments were stripped away literally and symbolically. Gone were the colors and symbols of their former lives. Instead, they were redressed in the plainest cloth available, garments spun from rough wool, thick linen, or camel hair, dyed in dull shades of gray, brown, or off-white. These clothes offered no protection against the harsh winters of Mongolia or the burning heat of the Gobi Desert. They were poorly stitched, recycled from older clothes, or sewn hastily by other slaves. Patches covered rips, and rope often replaced. Belts. Slaves working with animals smelled of sweat, dust, and dung, their sleeves torn, their shoulders marked with whip scars. The stench of smoke from cooking fires and drying hides clung to their tunics. There were no uniforms in the formal sense, but over time, one could distinguish a slave from a free person by a mere glance. While noble Mongols adorned themselves with layers of felt, brocade, or imported silk, and warriors wore studded leather, fur-lined hats, and bright sashes to signify their clan, slaves were draped in utility. Function, not fashion, defined their dress. Women slaves, particularly those serving in the tents of noble families, wore long robes tied at the waist, with sleeves shortened to avoid catching fire during cooking or weaving. Their heads were often covered with cloths, either to protect from dust or to signal modesty. Their robes rarely reached the ankles and were thin in cold seasons, causing many to suffer frostbite or illness. Some bore subtle branding on their clothing, woven knots, sewn in symbols, or colors that indicated who they belonged to. These visual codes helped keep order in sprawling camps with dozens or even hundreds of slaves. Clothing also revealed punishment. A slave caught stealing might be forced to wear a shameful hood or a rope collar for days. Others might be stripped, partially, their bruises and scars visible as a reminder to others. These were not just punishments, but public symbols, and clothing, or the lack thereof, was used as a tool of discipline. Slaves from prestigious backgrounds, scholars, translators, or artisans were sometimes allowed slightly better clothing. They might wear finer tunics, although still muted in color. The idea was not generosity, but preservation of usefulness. A calligrapher with frozen fingers was no help to the Khan's records. In some rare cases, female concubines of nobles were dressed in modest silks or thin veils to separate them from common workers, though they were still, in essence, property. Hair was another silent signifier. Male slaves working with livestock often had their heads shaved to avoid lice or infections. Others had hair matted, unwashed, hanging like ropes, uncared for under the pressure of endless days. Women sometimes wore braids or tied their hair with simple threads, but there was no time or reason for ornament. Beauty was irrelevant in a world of work. If a slave showed signs of grooming, it was usually at the behest of a master or for a ceremonial task. The Mongols did not dress their slaves for the slave's sake, but to ensure proper presentation. in the eyes of guests or rivals. Occasionally, during major feasts or state visits, slaves were temporarily dressed in coordinated colors to serve at gatherings, creating an illusion of wealth, control, and abundance. But these moments were brief, and once the guests departed, the borrowed garments were returned, and the slaves faded back into invisibility. Their clothing became worn again, fraying at the edges, stained by ash and sweat. There were no wardrobes, no spare tunics folded in quiet corners. Most owned only what they wore. When that wore out, they scavenged scraps, old blankets, or begged cast-offs from more fortunate kin. Even shoes were rare. Slaves often walked barefoot across frozen ground, or wore sandals woven from reeds or torn cloth. Blisters and infections were common. Winter was especially cruel. Frost crept into every seam, and many slaves wrapped their feet in animal skins or old saddle blankets to survive. Gloves were unknown to them, so they learned to work with numb fingers, teeth clenched against the sting. Yet despite the harshness, there was a strange dignity among some of the elder slaves. They stood a little straighter, even in rags. They stitched their clothes with care, washed them in rivers when they could, and passed down sewing tricks to the younger ones. Clothing, however humble, was one of the few things they could control. In whispered stories told around smoky fires, slaves spoke of what they once wore. A girl might recall her wedding robes in Samarkand, red with gold embroidery. A man might remember the blue sash of his clan in the northern forests. These memories clothed their minds when their bodies could not be covered, and so their appearance remained both a symbol and a prison. To their masters, the slaves were uniform and replaceable, but to themselves, every tear in the cloth, every stubborn stitch, held meaning. In the vast empire of the Khan, where power moved like storms and history galloped on horseback, these quiet figures dressed in brown and ash continued their silent work. They stitched and wrapped, washed and folded, always moving, always watching, always remembering. As you fall deeper into rest, imagine them not as shadows, but as threads in the vast tapestry of empire, threads worn thin, but not broken. Tomorrow, we will follow them further into their private worlds, their marriages, their love, and the forbidden romances that bloomed between rations and orders. But for now, sleep well, wrapped in the warm fabric of their forgotten tailies. The fire crackled low, and the stars blinked gently overhead. The sounds of the Mongol camp grew quiet, muffled by distance and fatigue. Horses shifted in their sleep. Dogs lay curled beside yurts, and only the wind whispered freely across the open land. But deep within the corners of this vast and structured world, hidden behind heavy canvas and weary eyes, were the quiet echoes of longing tales of love, union, and secret hearts beating within enslaved chests. In the Mongol Empire, where conquest defined life and submission shaped existence, the concept of marriage among slaves was not formally recognized, yet it was undeniably real. Though they were stripped of freedom, many slaves still sought companionship. Hand to hold in the dark, a voice to whisper to when the day was done, a face to remember in the moments before sleep. These relationships emerged not by permission, but by proximity and need. Within the sprawling camps, slaves often worked side by side, tending animals, gathering wood, preparing meals, and repairing tents. In the quiet repetitions of daily labor, glances were exchanged, kindnesses offered, and slowly bonds began to form. A shared bowl of curd, a laugh in the cold, a stitched tear in a tunic, such moments became the language of connection. Among slaves, there were two kinds of unions, those permitted by the master and those formed in secret. Some masters allowed, or even encouraged pairings among their slaves, especially when it ensured stability, increased productivity, or the birth of children who could serve in future. Such sanctioned unions were rudimentary, no ceremony, no written bond, just a nod of acknowledgement, and perhaps a tent space shared. Yet even these were fragile. A master could, at any time, separate couples, sell one away, or reassign duties. That placed lovers in different regions. The more common type of love among slaves was hidden, whispered in moonlight, and acted out behind tents or in stolen minutes before the dawn. These were the relationships that truly defied the empire, for they were not approved, not profitable, not visible. A Persian boy might fall in love with a girl from the Rus. A Chinese weaver might meet the gaze of a stable hand from Samarkand. Their tongues were different, their pasts unalike, but love raw and wordless needed no translation. And yet, these forbidden bonds came with great risk. If discovered, punishment could be swift and brutal. Lashes, separation, or public humiliation. Sometimes the woman would be blamed entirely, accused of distracting a fellow servant from his duties. There were stories told quietly, by firelight, of lovers torn apart and never reunited. But even such fear could not erase the human need for closeness. In the stillness of night, many slaves dared to hope. Some crafted rings from braided horsehair, or carved tokens from wood scraps, small symbols of affection, passed discreetly from hand to hand. A stolen kiss, a murmured vow, a shared blanket in winter. These became the ceremonies of the enslaved heart. Among slave couples who stayed together long enough, children were often born children, who were by law born into slavery as well. These young ones became the thread-tying couples to permanence. And though their families had no legal standing, no clan affiliation, they functioned with the same fierce devotion as any free family. Mothers worked tirelessly to shield their children from the cold and harshness. Fathers taught them what little they could, sometimes passing on native songs, or lost traditions in hushed lullabies. Marriage, in this world, was not defined by feasts or formalities, but by endurance. The act of staying loyal, of choosing love in a life ruled by force, was itself an act of defiance. And sometimes, astonishingly, these unions were noticed by their masters, especially if the pair proved reliable, hardworking, or if they bore children who served well. In rare cases, slave families were granted small patches of space to live slightly apart, offered marginal autonomy. These were meager mercies, but in the context of slavery, they became life-giving. Yet love among slaves did not always follow the paths of quiet devotion. There were also tales of passion, of jealousy, of betrayal. In a life where so little belonged to you, emotions could burn fiercely. A shared partner, an unspoken promise broken, a secret revealed, these could spark conflict, sometimes even drawing the attention of overseers, who responded with iron fists. Despite this, love endured. It endured in letters etched into wooden scraps and buried beneath tents. It endured in the flowers picked from wild grasses and left anonymously beside a sleeping form. It endured in the long, wordless looks past, between tasks and in the comfort of a shared silence. Some slaves fell in love with their masters, a far more complicated and dangerous entanglement. Sometimes this led to exploitation masked as affection. At other times, a favored concubine might be elevated to a position of comfort, though never true equality. Such relationships were rarely romantic in the purest sense. They were shaped by power imbalance and survival, and though feelings may have grown, they were rooted in necessity more than choice. Still, the lines often blurred, and history remembers more shadows than clear stories. Slaves had few opportunities to shape their fate, but in love, they found a fragment of freedom, a choice, however small, in a life otherwise commanded. Love did not erase the pain of their world, but it softened the edges. It gave warmth to bitter nights and meaning to endless days. It created memories that even slavery could not touch. As the fire dies to glowing embers and the air cools across the plains, their stories drift softly into sleep. The couple curled beneath a torn blanket, the young mother humming to her child, the secret lovers meeting between shores, all part of this empire, not in its chronicles of battle and conquest, but in its quiet, forgotten chapters. Their love was not written in ink, but in endurance, in touch, in time. And tonight, as you breathe slowly and your thoughts fade, you carry their memory in your rest. Tomorrow, we will move forward into the darker corners, into the reality of exploitation, into the abuses of power, and how intimacy could be twisted by dominance. But for now, sleep gently, wrapped in their fragile, forbidden bonds, ... the stars dim softly over the plains, as if they too are lowering their gaze from the shadows that stir beneath. In the silence between tents, where the cool air carries whispers instead of wind, there lies a truth rarely spoken aloud of those whose bodies were not their own, whose nights were not protected by privacy, and whose existence within the empire was reduced not only to labor, but to possession. In the mighty Mongol Empire, where men conquered lands and collected tribute from empires, women, especially enslaved women, often became trophies of war, symbols of dominance, and vessels of exploitation. Sexual slavery, though not officially codified, was a common and systemic aspect of Mongol rule, woven into the rhythm of conquest, rooted in the silent transactions between captor and captive. When Mongol warriors stormed cities and claimed victory, they divided the spoils. Gold, horses, fabrics, and food were taken. But so too were people artisans, children, and above all, women. Beauty became a curse in such moments. A young woman with delicate features, silk-wrapped hair, or bright eyes might be taken not for her labor, but for her body. She would be led from the ruins of her home into a foreign tent, into the hands of a man who had never spoken her name, who would never see her as anything but a symbol of what he had won. There were stories of women lined up before officers, inspected like livestock, selected like ornaments. The most desirable were offered to commanders or kept for the Khan's courts. Others were distributed among the ranks, passed down or traded, like goods. The word concubine softened what it truly was, ownership masked as intimacy. While some concubines gained influence, most lived lives of quiet suffering, their voices unheard, their choices stripped from them. These women existed in dual-role servants by day, companions by night, though neither title was freely chosen. Their identities were slowly erased, their memories replaced by routine. Some bore children for their masters, and while such children were sometimes treated better than ordinary slaves, the mothers themselves remained property, bound forever by chains invisible but tight. Not all victims of sexual slavery were women. Young boys, too, were vulnerable, especially those of attractive appearance or noble birth. Kept as court attendants, musicians, or personal aides, they lived under a constant haze of uncertainty, of glances held too long, of touches too familiar. In a world where power was absolute, consent meant nothing. The hierarchy of desire was dictated by status. A noble's whims were law. If he sought a slave for comfort, there was no refusal. Even kindness could become a prison when gentler. Masters took favorites. It often blurred the lines between privilege and coercion. A smile did not mean safety. A soft voice did not erase captivity. These relationships were built on imbalance, and love was rarely part of them. And yet, in the quiet hours, behind veils and curtains, some of these enslaved individuals tried to find themselves again. A concubine might hum lullabies from her homeland. A boy servant might carve tokens of protection, tucking them beneath bedding. They held on to fragments of identity, of hope, of humanity. But the weight of exploitation was heavy. There were no recourses, no justice. If a concubine grew ill or lost her beauty, she might be discarded, sold again, or forced into hard labor. If she refused her master, she could be beaten or worse. The empire had no courts for slaves, no refuge for the unwilling. Everything about their survival depended on silence, on endurance, on a careful masking of pain. There were moments when resistance surfaced, not with violence, but with withdrawal. A slave might speak less, eat less, retreat inward. Others found solace in each other, forming sisterhoods within the yurt walls, comforting those newly taken, sharing herbs and stories to help survive the nights. Some tried to end their lives, slipping into rivers or refusing food, though even death was not always mercifully granted. Masters did not view their slaves as companions, but as vessels either useful or not. And yet, a strange complexity shadowed some of these relationships. In rare cases, a slave's intelligence or loyalty could win a master's trust. She might be granted better clothing, less work, or influence within the household. But these were exceptions, not the rule. And still, the power imbalance never shifted. Her body remained a coin, her worth tied to the desires of another. The Mongol elite were not unique in these practices sexual. Slavery existed in many empires. But the scale of Mongol conquest, the speed of expansion, and the brutality of their warfare made the practice more systematic. From the steppes of Central Asia to the walls of Baghdad, slaves were taken, used, and passed along, woven into the empire's machinery without pause. Historians rarely recorded their names. Their stories were lost in the gaps between battles and treaties, buried in the smoke of burned cities. Yet they lived. They bled, they wept, they waited for morning. They remembered who they were, even as the world insisted they forget. And now, as we rest, their pain whispers across time, not to awaken guilt, but to awaken remembrance. These were not faceless victims. They were women with dreams, boys with laughter, humans with histories. And though they were broken, they were not erased. Tomorrow, we will walk away from this shadow and into their quiet routines once again. We will explore their hygiene, their struggle to stay clean in a dusty world, and how they fought disease and decay with scraps of knowledge and stubbornness of will. But for now, rest softly. Let the pain of this chapter fade into stillness. Their suffering, though real, is now honored by being known not as morning dew settled on the yellowing grass of the wide steppe. A faint mist rose like breath from the earth, drifting silently through the rows of tents and campfires, swirling past sleeping bodies wrapped in old furs. Among those who stirred earliest were the slaves woken not by luxury, but by the weight of duty, habit, and the day's demands. But before even the first task could begin, many faced a quieter struggle, one often ignored in history's loud tales of war and conquest. The effort to stay clean in a world built on dust, sweat, and decay. In the Mongol Empire, where movement was constant and settlement temporary, hygiene was both a necessity and a challenge. For the noble classes, washing was a ritual performed in basins with warm water, often scented with herbs, assisted by servants who poured and wiped and refilled. But for the slaves, there was no such comfort. Their cleanliness depended not on ritual, but on opportunity, on whether a stream was nearby, whether a master permitted a pause, whether the water wasn't already claimed for cooking or horses. Most slaves washed rarely, perhaps once every 10 days if lucky, more often once every month. Even then, it was a rushed process, splashes of icy water thrown over tired limbs, or a cloth soaked in rum until it turned dark with dirt. Soap, when available, was made from animal fat and ashes, rough and unpleasant, leaving the skin raw. More often, slaves used sand to scrub themselves, rubbing it over their arms, neck, and legs until the worst of the grime came loose. The dry scrub was painful, but effective. Sweat and animal filth stuck to the skin, and the desert winds caked every crevice with dust. To work among animals was to wear their scent goat musk, horse sweat, fermented milk. Slaves often smelled of fire smoke, sour milk, and soil, yet many tried to fight it. Women braided their hair to keep it from matting. Men used dull blades or sharpened stones to scrape their cheeks. Sometimes herbs or crushed leaves were chewed to freshen breath, though the bitterness lingered. Fingernails blackened with dirt were scrubbed against bark or stone, and feet so. Often bare or wrapped in cloth, or rinsed in cold streams if time allowed. There were no perfumes, no oils, save what dripped from meat or spilled from cooking. But still, the desire to feel clean remained strong, a quiet rebellion against the filth. Clothes, too, carried the memory of labor. Rarely washed, often shared, they accumulated weeks of grime. A tunic might be beaten against rocks in water, or left hanging over smoke to kill lice, though neither method was wholly effective. Vermin were constant companions, lice in bedding, fleas in furs, ticks in the grass. It was not uncommon for slaves to carry small wooden combs, carved by hand, to drag through their hair in futile hope. Some burned their bedding when it became too infested, sleeping then on bare ground until replacements could be scavenged. Illness followed this filth, a quiet hunter beneath the empire's surface. Colds and fevers were constant, but the worst came with seasons. Coughs that rattled, lungs in winter, oils that swelled in summer, and stomachs twisted by rotten food or unclean water. Diarrhea spread swiftly in crowded camps. Skin infections blackened legs and arms. Tuberculosis, though unnamed, lived in the coughing breaths of the dying. The Mongols moved quickly when needed, but not fast enough to outrun disease. When one slave grew ill, many followed. Quarantine was rare. Most were expected to work through sickness, unless they could no longer stand. Then they were laid aside, covered with rags, and left to recover or not. Few were treated with medicines. The empire possessed skilled healers, but they were reserved for nobles, generals, or prized warriors. Slaves relied on each other on old remedies whispered across cultures. Crushed garlic wrapped in cloth for infection, goat milk mixed with ash for fever, chewed willow bark for pain. Some slaves from distant lands brought their own knowledge Chinese. Girls with tea leaves and powders. Persian women with balms made from animal fat and herbs. These methods helped sometimes, though more often they only delayed the inevitable. When a slave died, their body was often burned if disease was suspected, or buried in shallow ground near the camp's edge. There were no rituals, no prayers, save what a friend might whisper quickly under their breath. Illness carried more than pain. It carried shame. A sick slave was seen as weak, unworthy of effort. They might be replaced, sold, or left behind when the camp moved. And yet, amidst all this, many slaves clung fiercely to cleanliness, not as luxury, but as identity. To wash your face, to comb your hair, to scrub your hands after work, these were acts of memory, of a life before bondage. It was in washing one another's wounds that friendships were born. It was in sharing a cloth soaked in mint water that some found comfort. The old women often knew the best ways to stay clean smoke baths, clay masks, or boiling cloth in horse urine to kill disease. These were hard lessons, passed down like wisdom and treasured like gold. In rare instances, a kind master allowed better conditions. Slaves assigned to temples, bathhouses, or elite homes might have access to warm water and cloth towels. Some concubines were bathed daily, though always under command. But most toiled with dirt beneath their nails, scars on their skin, and the hope of a wash hanging always just out of reach. The Mongol Empire, for all its grandeur and movement, left little space for rest. The camps rose and fell like waves, and disease traveled with them. Yet the slaves endured, fighting off infection with stubborn breath, guarding their few clean possessions like sacred relics. Even a single comb, a single scrap of clean cloth, was a source of pride. And so, as the night falls again, and the fires glow faint across the hills, the slaves once more prepare for rest-wrapping themselves in whatever warmth they can find, whispering old remedies, and hoping that tomorrow they might wake without fever, without sores, without the weight of sickness dragging their limbs. In their struggle for cleanliness, they preserved more than health. They preserved humanity. Tomorrow, we will follow them into the next reality, how death visited often, and how the dead were treated, mourned and buried, or forgotten, beneath the Empire's ever-moving footsteps. But for now, breathe slowly. Let your own thoughts drift gently. And remember, even in the darkest corners of history, someone always tried to stay clean-dot as the last embers of the evening fire fade into faint orange whispers, and the stars begin to cast their soft light on the open lands of the Mongol plains. A different stillness settles across the camps, not the stillness of rest, but the quiet weight of those who do not rise. Among the many burdens borne by the slaves of the Empire, death was not a release so much as a silence, often unnoticed, unmarked, and quickly swept aside. Where life had been hard, noisy, and commanded, death arrived without pause, without honor, and more often than not, without ceremony. The Mongol Empire moved fast, and the lives of slaves were considered threads easily broken, easily replaced. When a slave grew ill or too old to work, they would be quietly set aside. If the master was kind or the situation allowed, they might be offered water, a few warm rags, or a quiet corner of the tent. If not, they might be left in the open air, under furs or alone by a dying fire. The Empire had no healers for slaves, and no rites reserved for their passing. Their breath slowed, their eyes dimmed, and eventually they slipped from the world, their names carried only in the memories of other servants. The handling of a slave's body depended on the context. In the field, far from cities or shrines, there was no time for ritual. Other slaves, usually the youngest or the least favored, were ordered to take the body away to a distant place beyond the edge of the camp. Sometimes the corpse was buried shallow, wrapped in a discarded blanket, or laid in a pit scraped hastily from the dirt. Stones might be placed to deter animals, or a makeshift marker set in the earth. A broken staff, a piece of rope, a stone carved with a symbol only the mourners understood. But more often than not, it was nothing. No grave, no marker, no word. The earth simply took them. The body disappeared, and life continued. In winter, when the ground was too hard to dig, corpses were left above the soil, covered loosely with branches or snow. In some cases, they were burned on pyres built from dung and old wood. The smoke of slave funerals was thin and gray, lacking incense, lacking prayer. It drifted across the plains unnoticed. In cities, slaves who died while working were dragged away, sometimes to refuse heaps or burned with garbage. In rare cases, when a slave was beloved by other slaves, or when they had shared years of quiet friendship, a small vigil might be held, nothing loud, nothing public, just a soft chant, a whispered song from the homeland, or a prayer mouthed into the darkness. One slave might braid a string and tie it to the wrist of the dead. Another might press a coin or carved pebble into their hand, hoping to ease their journey, though few believed such gestures were enough. Among the Mongols themselves, the dead were treated with deep respect. Nobles buried with treasures, warriors with their weapons, even horses slain to join their masters in the next world. But for slaves, such reverence was a distant dream. Their deaths were not considered losses. They were logistical shifts, spaces to be filled, roles to be reassigned. And yet, in death, Many slaves left behind small echoes. A concubine's scarf folded beneath her bedding. A herder's worn boots beside a fire. A potter's favorite tool, carved with tiny symbols. These remnants were not buried, but inherited, passed down, or tucked away by those who remembered. And so even when graves were shallow or absent, memory remained. Sometimes slaves buried their own in secret. Late at night, when the camp slept, they would slip away with the body, dig by hand or with flat stones, and press the dead into the earth. With tears wiped quickly away, they buried with care straightening limbs, folding hands, placing wildflowers or bits of cloth near the chest. In those moments, they reclaimed some dignity. They gave their companion a rest not provided by empire, but by love. Disease often brought death in waves. When fever spread, dozens might fall within a week, and there was no time, no room. Pits were dug and filled quickly. Slaves coughed beside dying companions, prayed silently not to follow, and held each other when strength allowed. After such outbreaks, the camps would move on, leaving the dead behind. And as new fires lit in new fields, only the slaves carried the weight of what had been lost. Some would later return to old camps, searching the ground for signs of patch, of scorched grass, a row of stones half buried, a familiar tree. They would kneel, touch the soil, and whisper a name only they remembered. Not all deaths were quiet. Some were violent punishments gone too far, failed escape attempts, or harsh winters that took the weak. These deaths left marks on those who witnessed them. Slaves carried the memory in their eyes, in their silences, in their trembling hands. That resumed work the next morning. They learned to grieve inwardly. They learned that mourning was a luxury, one they could not afford. Yet despite it all, death did not erase the humanity of the enslaved. It merely folded it into the soil, into the wind, into the shadows between tents. Every slave lost became a whisper in the steppe, a hush in the branches, a breath across the coals, and those who survived carried them forward through stories, songs, or simple remembrance. They remembered not just how they died, but how they lived. The laugh that once echoed near the water pot, the hands that once stitched furs, the voice that once sang to the moon. In time, even these memories faded, but the land remembered. The Mongol Empire rose, roared, and eventually fell. Its banners lowered, its cities crumbled. But beneath the plains and valleys, where its armies once thundered, the bones of slaves remain. Not in marked graves, not in histories, but in the very dust that still catches the wind. As you close your eyes tonight and drift into rest, imagine them there not as shadows, but as part of the earth, still whispering. Tomorrow, we walk into the markets and counting halls to see how slaves were bought, sold, and priced in coins and cattle. But for now, let sleep take you gently, and may you remember those whose rest was long delayed out in the soft glow of dawn. When the last stars fade into the pale horizon and the chill of night gives way to the low hum of rising voices, the camps of the Mongol Empire begin to stir. But far from the fields and tents where fires are kindled and duties resumed, in the more bustling corners of the empire, near trade routes, cities, or temporary war encampments, another kind of space comes to life. Here, where coins clink, softly, and merchants arrange their wares, the slave market unfolds not with shouting or song, but with quiet calculation and the cold exchange of ownership. These markets were not always permanent. Sometimes they were woven into weekly trading, grounds where horses, wool, spices, and meat were bartered. Other times, they were temporary setups outside city walls, where war loot was distributed and human beings were sold like grain or tools. The Mongol Empire, in all its scope, had no uniform law regulating the slave trade, but the practice was widespread, accepted, and profitable. Slavery was not an afterthought of war, but a currency born from it. Every city conquered, every tribe subdued, brought with it captives. These captives, young and old, male and female, skilled and unskilled, were lined up, inspected, and assessed. Traders arrived from all corners: Chinese, Persian, Arab, Turkic, even Venetian merchants following the Silk Road. They came seeking value in human form. The market itself was often arranged in quiet lanes or wide courtyards, shaded by cloth, canopies, or tree branches. Slaves stood or knelt, grouped by age, sex, or skill. Children were displayed near women, often held by hand or bound gently at the wrist. Young boys of fair complexion fetched high prices, especially if literate or trained in music. Women were inspected for beauty and health, their teeth, hair, and skin, quietly studied by buyers with cold eyes. Men were judged by muscle, scars, or profession. A blacksmith from Bukhara, a shepherd from the Caucasus, a dancer from Samarkand, a translator from the eastern cities. Each had a price, determined not by their past or dreams, but by their usefulness. The Mongol officers overseeing the transactions made little distinction between selling a horse and selling a human. Buyers were allowed to ask questions, to inspect hands and backs, to order the slave to walk, speak, or lift objects. Shame was a forgotten word here. The enslaved stood still, many trained by fear to hide emotion, to present compliance as protection. Behind them, other slaves waited in carts or pens, their eyes darting, ears catching familiar dialects. Sometimes a family was brought together, then torn apart again, children taken one direction, parents another. There was no appeal, no pause, only transaction. Prices fluctuated based on region and demand. A strong male slave might fetch 10 horses. A beautiful concubine might be valued at 50 bolts of silk. A young servant boy could be traded for a fine weapon or exotic dye. Some slaves were bartered, not sold exchanged for livestock, furs, or even other slaves. Traders kept careful ledgers in many languages, noting origin, age, skill, and price. Some branded their new property immediately. Others marked them with collars or ink symbols that would fade over time. Those who bought in bulk 40, 60, 100 captives from a single campaign were usually bound for the cities, where they'd be divided and resold in smaller groups. The trade was brisk, the profits reliable, and the victims voiceless. Certain markets became known for specialties. In the east, near the borders of the Jin dynasty, Mongol markets offered Chinese, artisans, scribes, and scholars. In the west, near the edges of Persia and the steppes, one could find soldiers, herders, and beautiful girls of mixed Turkic and Iranian descent. Northward, near Rus territories, the markets leaned heavily on robust men, captured after raids, their hands still bearing the calluses of axe and field. Some buyers were local lords. Others were wandering traders who transported slaves to distant empires, sometimes into the Islamic caliphates, sometimes as far as Byzantine lands, where demand for exotic servants remained strong. There were whispers, too, of certain nobles who collected specific types: the blonde-haired, the green-eyed, the rare-skinned. In such cases, beauty itself became a trap, and rumors passed between slaves like prayers. Don't meet the merchant's eye, don't smile too much, don't show your teeth unless asked. The fear of being noticed was often greater than the fear of being ignored. And yet, for all its cruelty, the market was not always harsh in appearance. It was orderly, quiet, efficient. There was no shouting, no chains dragged through mud. Instead, the cruelty lived in stillness, in silence, in the calm tone of a trader naming a price, in the flick of a cloth being pulled off a child's shoulders to display their arms, in the absence of protest. Slaves were taught early not to cry, not to beg. It did no good. Buyers ignored tears as easily as wind. Sellers preferred their stock to be calm, trained, and silent. Occasionally, a slave might resist run, bite, shout. Such moments were rare, short-lived, and violently ended. Discipline was swift. Blood washed quickly. The market resumed. After sale, the enslaved were taken by wagon or on foot to their new homes, palaces, tents, monasteries, or caravans. Some went east to serve noble houses. Some went west to join merchant fleets. Others vanished into mines, farms, brothels, or kitchens. A few, very few, were later free bought by relatives, rewarded for service, or granted liberty by a dying master. But most never left the chain of ownership. The market was only the beginning. Its effect was lasting. For the slaves who passed through these markets, the memories remained etched in every glance, every sound, the smell of horse sweat and boiled leather, the quiet thud of coins placed in a palm, the cool voice of a buyer deciding their fate, the feel of eyes appraising like butcher's scales. These became part of them, carried in their posture, in their silences. Years later, even in different lands, under different names, those moments lingered. In the empire's memory, slave markets were not chapters, they were tools. They sustained labor, funded wars, and kept the system turning. But in the memories of those sold, they were scars. Deep, invisible, but enduring. As sleep approaches, tonight, as your breath slows and your thoughts drift, remember the ones who once stood in lines, not for justice or bread, but for judgment. Tomorrow, we will walk beside them as they are moved from these markets into homes, into roles, into the long daily work of servitude under Mongol lords. But for now, rest deeply, knowing their story is not forgotten, not by time, not by wind, and not by you. As the sun climbed slowly above the endless plains, casting soft gold across the tops of nomadic tents that rippled gently in the breeze. Life within the elite Mongol camps stirred with practiced rhythm. The air inside these grand yurts larger, richer, and more finely adorned than any ordinary dwelling, was thick with the scent of heated milk, oiled leather, dried herbs, and woolen blankets. Felt-lined walls softened the sounds of the outside world, but inside, beneath the curved roof of wood and silk, footsteps moved without echo footsteps of those not born to privilege, but brought into it by command, the slaves of the noble tents. Here, within the private worlds of khans, commanders, and royal wives, domestic slaves played an invisible yet vital role. They did not ride horses or raise swords. They held ladles, carried firewood, brushed cloaks, mended carpets, cradled babies, and listened always for the quietest call. Each elite tent had its own hierarchy, not just among the owners, but among the servants. At the bottom were the runners and firekeepers, often boys or older men, tasked with hauling water, fetching dung for fuel, contending the coals that warmed the rich interiors. Above them were the food handlers, women and girls who stirred milk into fermented drinks, chopped herbs into stews, and kept the copper pots gleaming. Even higher were the personal aides, those permitted to enter the inner circle of the family, who folded garments, massaged sore limbs, combed hair, and stood silently behind their masters during long evening conversations. The daily life of a domestic slave began before sunrise. They rose in the cold, often after sleeping inside shelters attached to the main yurt, or even curled beside animals for warmth. Their first duty was warmth itself, rekindling the fire within the hearth of the master's tent, ensuring the air was temperate before noble feet touched the felt floor. Then came drink the heating of salted tea or milk, poured carefully into delicate bowls and offered with eyes lowered. Mistakes were not tolerated. A spilled bowl, a dish served too cold, a delay in service, any of these could lead to scolding, slaps, or worse. In some tents, masters were kind or indifferent. In others, cruelty was casual and punishment part of routine. Domestic slaves learned quickly to read moods, to anticipate needs before they were voiced. They mastered the art of invisibility, how to move silently, to blend with shadows, to breathe softly. It was said that the best servant could pour a drink before a master's thirst was spoken aloud. The noble women of the Mongol elite often oversaw large households. Some were commanding, keeping a structured system among the domestic slaves, assigning tasks, resolving disputes. Others left it to elder slaves, women who had served since girlhood and now held informal power among the staff. These elder slaves were both feared and respected. They knew the preferences of every person in the tent, remembered the birth of children, the timing of ceremonies, the folding of specific garments. Their knowledge was vast, their freedom non-existent. Bathing rituals were important, especially for nobles, and it was the task of domestic slaves to prepare water heated in iron pots, poured into wooden tubs, and scented with crushed leaves or horse chestnut. Slaves scrubbed the backs of their masters, cleaned bowls, folded damp cloths, and then vanished before steam cleared from the air. In some cases, they washed the clothing as well kneeling beside streams, beating fabric with smooth stones, then laying it on warm rocks to dry. There were no holidays, no days of rest. Life flowed in a circle of service. During feasts, domestic slaves worked from before sunrise to deep into night roasting meat, laying dishes, refilling cups, and managing the needs of dozens of guests. They moved through the tents with lowered eyes and quiet hands. If noticed, it was usually to be ordered, occasionally praised, sometimes punished. Some domestic slaves raised the children of their masters. They rocked them to sleep, whispered lullabies in foreign tongues, rubbed their bellies during illness. These bonds, though deep, were one-sided. The child might grow to forget the woman who had once fed and bathed them, the man who had once carried them on sore shoulders through a rainstorm. The slave remained, but the affection did not. Even among affection, there was control. Personal slaves, those chosen for their beauty, gentleness, or intelligence, were sometimes called upon for more than service. They became confidants, entertainers, and in many cases, unwilling companions in the night. The boundaries blurred within the velvet walls of elite tents. Silence was expected, submission rewarded. Some domestic slaves developed skill in storytelling, music, embroidery, or herbal medicine. If a master valued such talents, they were allowed to practice them, but always on command. A weaver might be summoned to create a wall hanging, a singer to calm a crying child, an herbalist to ease a noble's stomach ache. These skills gave the illusion of privilege, but not the reality of freedom. Their comfort was conditional. There were whispers, too, of trust earned. Some domestic slaves, through years of loyalty, came to hold small influence. A word offered quietly, a warning delivered in time, a task completed without request. These might earn them better food, a warmer sleeping mat, or protection from harsher voices. But this trust was fragile. One error, one rumor, one misstep, and all could be lost. They lived on a blade's edge, beneath tapestries and beside fire, always watching, always working. And yet, despite everything, they endured. Within their quiet world, they formed bonds. They shared stories during laundry, hung together over cooking pots, traded thread and buttons, taught each other foreign songs. They became each other's families, finding comfort in the familiarity of routine. A girl who arrived at 10 might still be there at 30, her hands worn but steady, her eyes sharp. she would have buried others, welcomed new ones, and carried on without break. These domestic slaves were the heartbeat of noble life. Every garment worn, every meal eaten, every tent cleaned, every fire lit, they were there. Unnamed in records, unpainted in portraits, but present in every breath of the elite's world. As you drift into sleep tonight, think of them not as shadows, but as quiet threads holding the empire together from within. Tomorrow, we will leave the tents and step into the world of field labor and forced migration, where slaves carried the empire's weight across deserts and rivers. But for now, close your eyes, let your breath slow, and remember the hands that tucked in every corner of silk, that stirred every pot of milk, that vanished before sunrise, only to return before dusk dawned. As the pale light of morning seeped through the vast horizon and the cool mist began to retreat beneath the warmth of the rising sun. The open fields came to life, not with the noble calls of generals or the gallop of mounted warriors, but with the soft shuffling of feet, the quiet heaving of breath, and the low groans of burdened carts. Here, far from the ornate tents of the fey, elite and the ceremonial spaces of power, the field slaves of the Mongol Empire began their day not with fanfare, but with obligation. These were the silent workers of the earth, the nameless hands that built the foundations of the empire, not in ink or gold, but in dust and muscle. Field slaves were among the most numerous and yet least acknowledged in Mongol society. They did not serve noble households or accompany royalty. Instead, they followed the needs of the land-tending herds, cultivating grain, building roads, digging ditches, foraging for wood, or hauling goods along endless distances. Many were war captives, transported far from their native regions, and resettled into frontier zones or pasture lands where the empire's infrastructure was still fragile, still hungry for labor. Life for these slaves began before sunrise, often with a chill that crept through thin woolen wraps and stiffened fingers before tools could be gripped. They emerged from huts, holes in the earth, or makeshift shelters fashioned from branches and discarded fabrics. Some slept under carts or beside animals, wrapped in the same blankets that warmed the oxen. They ate little, perhaps a bowl of curdled milk, a hardened piece of bread, or soup thinned so far it tasted only of smoke. And then, without word, they set to work. In the grazing fields of the steppes, slaves tended vast herds of sheep, goats, yaks, and horses. These animals were the pride of the Mongol identity, the pillars of their economy and mobility. Yet it was not nobles who managed them. It was slaves who walked for hours behind flocks, who pulled birthing calves from their mothers, who fought off wolves in the night, and who froze their toes in muddy water during winter. A lost animal meant punishment. A sick one brought blame. The Mongols depended on their livestock for meat, milk, leather, and trade. The slaves ensured their survival. In more settled regions, where the Mongols ruled over agrarian populations, slaves worked the soil, harvesting barley, wheat, millet, and onions. They dug irrigation trenches with wooden tools, carried baskets of wet soil on their backs, and planted seeds row after row beneath a beating sun. Their backs bent early in life. Their feet grew calloused and cracked. Blisters turned to scars, fingers to stone. In winter, they broke ice to water the animals. In summer, they chased shade they were never allowed to rest in. These workers were not counted in treaties or diplomatic records. They were moved in groups, often shackled or supervised, sometimes transported with livestock. Slave labor camps were temporary, mobile, but brutal in structure. Overseers, sometimes Mongols, sometimes favored slaves given cruel authority, walked with whips and wooden rods, shouting commands, marking time. Slaves were not allowed to speak freely, rest without permission, or leave their designated area. Attempts to escape were rare and almost always fatal. Punishment was swift: lashings, branding, public beatings. Some were forced to work without water as penance. Others were tied for days, exposed to sun or frost, as example to the rest. And yet, among these field slaves were the builders of roads, the dredgers of canals, the haulers of timber. It was they who created the pathways by which the Mongol military moved, the bridges that crossed over rivers, the stone foundations of way stations and warehouses. Their work shaped the geography of the empire. Their feet left paths still visible centuries later. The hardest labor came during campaigns. When the Mongol armies moved swift, silent, unrelenting, they brought with them entire support caravans. Slaves drove the supply carts, carried weapon stockpiles, cooked in the rear camps, patched armor, or buried the dead. They traveled in dust, often without shoes, sleep, or shade. They moved in silence, beneath banners they were never allowed to touch. At the end of each day, they set up tents for others to sleep in, only to lie in the dirt themselves. Some fell on the march and were left behind. There was no time to mourn. The empire moved forward. The stronger slaves carried others. Sometimes, a mother would tie her child to her back and walk all day without pause. Sometimes an old man would prop himself with a stick, determined not to be abandoned. These were not slaves of story and legend. They were the unnamed, the forgotten. But they were there, in every ditch, every footprint, carved into frozen earth. Over time, a quiet order emerged. Slaves formed small communities, helping one another survive. They learned to hide scraps of food, to share warmth, to create tools from bones or stones. They sang soft songs from distant lands while working songs that turned to hums when overseers came near. They buried their dead with hands and sticks, marking graves with woven grass or etched stones. No one else would do it for them. Yet even in the harshest conditions, field slaves held onto fragments of memory. Some carried charms from home, a carved bead, a piece of colored cloth, a small prayer scroll. Others etched symbols into trees, leaving signs for others from their homeland. They found moments of relief in the simplest things: a cold stream to wash in, a kind look from a fellow worker, the warmth of a fire they built themselves. These quiet gestures became resistance, a way to remain human in a world that treated them otherwise. As the day faded and stars returned once more to the steppe sky, the slaves of the field lay their bodies on the earth they had moved, carved, planted, and watered with sweat. Their backs ached, their hands throbbed, their stomachs growled. But they had survived another day, another task, another mile. And with the last breath before sleep, they dreamed of freedom, not as a place, but as a feeling. The warmth of home, the voice of a mother, the stillness of a world without command. Tomorrow, we will follow some of them deeper still into the households of common Mongols, where slavery existed in smaller, quieter ways, and yet with equal weight. But for now, rest easy. Let your breath slow, your body soften, and your mind drift like the fields beneath the wind. The slaves of the earth are remembered tonight, and they are not alone. As the low hum of wind settled once again over the steppe and the stars blinked awake in the broad night sky, the campfires of the Mongol world flickered gently in their places. From the grand encampments of nobles to the modest hearths of common herders. While the great khans ruled from tents stitched with silk and guarded by warriors, the majority of the Mongol people lived more simply in smaller yurts scattered across hillsides, valleys, and riverbanks, where survival depended not on command, but on quiet endurance. And within these humble homes, too, the system of slavery persisted, not as spectacle, not as policy, but as a woven thread in the daily fabric of life. These were not slave markets nor battlegrounds, but homes where warmth came from young fires, and meals were boiled from dried meat and wild roots. Yet even here, in the silence of common life, there were those who labored not by choice, but by ownership. Slavery among the ordinary people of the Mongol Empire took a subtler form. Commoners, though far removed from the splendor of courts or the spoils of war, still acquired slaves through inheritance, barter, gifts from higher lords, or as leftovers from raiding parties. A family might own 1 or 2 slaves, sometimes more, depending on their wealth or favor. These slaves lived not in separate quarters, but often within the same tent, their presence woven into every corner sweeping, stirring, fetching, folding, stitching, feeding animals, gathering herbs, carrying water from distant streams, or nursing the sick. They were not chained, but neither were they free. A single glance could summon them. A single command could change their day. And yet, there, labor kept these modest homes standing. A slave in a common household rose before the rest, stirring the fire back to life from embers buried deep in ash. She prepared morning milk, watered the goats, cleaned the utensils from the previous night. The yurt had no corners, but her place was always the edge near the door in winter cold, near the kitchen fire in summer heat. When the family stirred, she vanished into tasks, ensuring bowls were filled, boots were patched, and furs laid neatly by the beds. The presence of such slaves was normalized, even among the poor. Children of the family learned early that certain people in their home listened more quickly, worked longer hours, and were expected to disappear when not needed. Slaves raised these children, too braiding their hair, telling them stories from other lands, teaching them lullabies in foreign tongues. And yet, when those children grew older, many forgot the faces of those who had once held them. The most common form of slavery in these households was domestic servitude, but fieldwork was frequent too. A slave might walk alongside her mistress, gathering firewood or helping shear wool. A man might assist in trapping, herding, or carrying goods to local markets. In lean seasons, when food was scarce, the master's family always ate first. The slave waited, often in silence, for scraps. Illness brought no pause. A sick slave was still expected to work. Some were given simple herbs to chew, but care was minimal. If they grew too weak, they were allowed to rest, but only if their absence would not harm the family's rhythm. If they died, the burial was brief. Sometimes the family offered a whispered prayer. Other times, they simply wrapped the body and left it on the step's edge. There was rarely cruelty in these homes, but there was no compassion either, not the kind that brought freedom. Instead, there was a quiet indifference, an understanding that this person belonged to them, like a pot, a sheep, or a length of rope. The bond between slave and master was not one of brutality, but of ownership so complete it no longer needed assertion. There were moments of kindness. A child might offer a ribbon. A mother might share a better piece of meat. An old man might tell stories beside the fire and allow the slave to listen. These moments shimmered like water in desert heat, real but rare and always brief. Over time, a slave became part of the tent, part of the stories told over meals, part of the hands that helped survive winters and childbirth. But they were never part of the family. Their name might be used in affection, but it was never carried into inheritance. Some slaves lived decades in these homes, growing old among the same faces, holding the same bowl, hatching the same rug again and again. And when their strength failed, they were often replaced quietly. No ceremony, no thanks, just absence. There were exceptions, of course. In rare instances, a slave was freed for loyalty, for bravery, or by the dying wish of a master. Some slaves were given land small patches, poor in soil, where they continued to live as tenant laborers, never quite equal, but no longer owned. Others married fellow slaves or even commoners, though such unions required permission and rarely changed status. In the evenings, when the fire dimmed and the tent grew quiet, these slaves found small pieces of themselves again. They hummed songs from their childhoods, whispered names of lost family, traced patterns in the dirt with calloused fingers. They existed in silence, but their inner world pulsed with memory. A girl from a far land remembered the sound of bells in her old village. A man recalled the taste of fruit from his childhood. A boy dreamed of a river he had not seen in years. These memories kept them whole. The steppe winds never asked who was free and who was not. They passed over all alike, brushing cheeks and tents and fires with the same touch. And yet, the slaves felt the difference in every command, every withheld word, every glance. Their world was shaped not by walls or chains, but by distance from choice, from noise, from name. As the fire lowers now and your breathing deepens, picture those quiet corners. A woman kneeling by a boiling pot. A man stitching a torn boot beneath a hanging saddle. A boy brushing the hair of a child who would grow to forget him. Their work was unnoticed, their names unrecorded, but their presence was constant. Tomorrow, we will rise with them again, this time into the world of Mongol warfare, where slaves marched not beside, but behind the army carrying weight, tending wounds, and sometimes bleeding in silence. But for now, close your eyes. Let the hush of the steppe settle in. You are among the quiet ones now, where even the forgotten or gently remembered dot as the earth trembled beneath the thunder of hooves and the cry of warriors pierced the wind-swept plains. History recorded the Mongol war machine as swift, efficient, and unstoppable. It spoke of archers on horseback, of brilliant tactics, and of cities burned to ash. But behind every advance and siege, in the dusty wake of banners fluttering, against the steppe sky, came those who made conquest possible, yet were never counted among the heroes. These were the slaves bound, not by armor, but by duty, not clad in iron, but in dust and silence. While the warriors charged ahead, these men and women labored in the shadows of war, keeping the heart of the army beating without ever holding a sword. Their role in warfare was essential, invisible, and often deadly. Every Mongol campaign, whether it crossed deserts, scaled mountains, or encircled fortified cities, required an immense support system. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles. Horses needed fodder. Soldiers required meals, gear, and warmth. Siege engines had to be built and repaired. Wounded fighters needed tending. The roads had to remain open, and it was the slaves who filled these silent roles. When a Mongol army prepared for war, it moved with not just soldiers, but entire caravans of laborers' slaves conscripted to haul provisions, erect tents, prepare food, manage livestock, and carry the weight of empire on their backs. Their day began long before sunrise and ended well after the warriors slept. They rose from camps pitched outside the ring of command, often sleeping on bare earth or beneath ox carts. Without complaint, because complaint brought punishment, they hoisted sacks of grain, pulled carts across muddy ground, patched worn-out saddles, and collected firewood in frozen forests. Some slaves worked as cooks, bending over boiling pots, stirring stews made from dried meat and root vegetables. Others tended the war horses, brushing their coats, checking hooves, and preparing water. A single mistake, a torn strap, a spoiled ration, a delayed delivery could bring the wrath of commanders. Slaves moved quickly, quietly, bowing low when spoken to, eyes fixed downward. But the most harrowing work came after the battle. When the noise of war faded, when the warriors returned bloodied but victorious, it was the slaves who entered the field. They moved among the bodies, friend and foe alike, collecting weapons, salvaging armor, stacking the fallen. Some were ordered to dig graves, deep and wide under the open sky. Others dragged corpses into piles for burning, the smoke of war thickening as day turned to dusk. They wrapped wounds with whatever cloth they could spare. They fetched water for the bleeding. They carried the dying to shaded corners, where prayers were whispered in a dozen forgotten tongues. No songs were sung for them. No cheers awaited their return. Their reward was survival, and that too not always guaranteed. During long campaigns, slaves became sick from fatigue, hunger, or disease. Dysentery swept through supply caravans like fire through dry grass. Frostbite took fingers. Heat exhaustion stole breath. But the army marched on, and so did they. If a slave collapsed, they were pulled aside. If they cried out in pain, they were silenced. The empire had no time for those who could not keep up. Yet their absence was always noticed, because without them, the machine faltered. In sieges, slaves performed the hardest tasks. They hauled timber to build siege towers and ladders. They gathered rocks and mud for battering rams, and filled the trenches dug to approach city walls. When cities fell, it was often the slaves who sorted the spoils, stacking goods, separating prisoners, organizing loot. Some were ordered to lead captured animals or escort new captives. Others were given torches and told where to burn. Though they did not start the fires, they were made to carry the flame. Some Mongol generals used slaves as human shields, forcing them to march ahead of soldiers to absorb the first wave of arrows. Others conscripted slaves to drag siege equipment into range, even as enemy missiles rained down. In such moments, a slave's life was not only expendable, it was strategic. Among the most grueling duties was the maintenance of roads and bridges along the warpath. Slaves carried stones and laid timber across marshes. They carved narrow mountain passes with crude tools. When rivers swelled, they built makeshift crossings from boats lashed together, all under the whip's watch. And when storms struck, it was they who stood waist-deep in mud, guiding oxen and carts through chaos. These slaves rarely spoke of freedom. It was not a word they could afford. They thought of warmth, a full belly, a night without lashes. They bonded with one another, learned each other's languages in fragments, passed around strips of dried meat, or traded tailies from their homeland. In these moments, they reclaimed tiny pieces of themselves. They made friends who carried them. When they limped, they made jokes in the quiet shared combs, patched one another's shoes. And when one fell, the others remembered. Sometimes they buried a fallen comrade quickly, with a stone on the chest and a prayer murmured through cracked lips. Sometimes they simply left behind a marker, a stick tied with thread, a scrap of red cloth. Something to say, someone passed here, someone mattered. History does not name them. The generals receive the glory, the warriors the songs. But the slaves who bled into the soil, who marched behind the army, who kept it moving across half the world, they too built the empire. Without them, the horses would have stumbled, the archers gone hungry, the wheels refused to turn. Their hands were on every wheel, their footprints beneath every banner. And so tonight, as you sink into rest and your breath slows like the fading wind, remember them not as shadows, but as silent bearers of empire. Tomorrow, we will return to the homes they built but never owned, to the slave families and thee, lives born into bondage. But for now, let sleep take you gently. The march has ended for tonight, and the quiet ones behind the battle lines are finally still dot as the pale moon drifted across the sky and cast its soft silver light upon the vast sleeping plains of the Mongol Empire. The quietest places came, alive not with noise, but with the smallest of sounds, the rustle of a blanket, the breath of a sleeping child, the soft whimper of dreams too young to understand their chains. In these hidden corners, where the yurt's walls curved inward, like folded arms, Slave children dreamed beneath the same stars as noble heirs, yet their paths were never meant to touch. These children, born not in freedom, but within the confines of ownership, opened their eyes into a world that had already decided their place. To be born the child of a slave in the Mongol Empire was to inherit not a name or legacy, but a condition, quiet agreement written not in ink, but in silence. These children were never asked who they wished to become. They were simply assigned a role before they could walk. Some were the children of two enslaved parents' quiet unions formed between laborers who shared hardship and hope. Others were born of violence, the offspring of concubines and masters, their lives more complicated, their status sometimes ambiguous. A few were the result of forbidden bonds, hidden in secrecy, raised beneath a veil of caution. Regardless of origin, their fate remained largely the same. A child born to slaves was a slave. There were no exceptions unless a master decreed otherwise. The moment they took their first breath, they were woven into the tapestry of labor. As toddlers, they were carried on the backs of their mothers during work, swaddled in cloth while the older hands tended fires or gathered fodder. Their lullabies were whispered in stolen tongues, melodies from lost lands, passed from mother to child like heirlooms no one else could see. These were the moments where warmth lived in the arms of a tired mother, in the hum of a tune once sung in freedom. But the softness of childhood did not last long. By the age of 5 or 6, most slave children began to work in small ways, carrying water in leather skins, collecting sticks for firewood, chasing livestock, or feeding poultry. Their hands, once soft, grew calloused before they learned to write. There were no toys, no schooling, save for what they learned through observation and whispered lessons from elders. They were taught to speak the master's language quickly, to understand commands, to stay silent unless spoken to. Play existed in rare bursts, in hiding, in corners, in the stolen minutes between chores. 2 children might roll pebbles on a tent floor, draw pictures in ash, or invent games using bits of bone and cloth. But such joy was fleeting. Laughter had to be quiet. Too much noise invited scolding, and the smallest offense could bring the same punishment as an adult would bear. Discipline did not wait for maturity. A child who spilled milk or failed to return promptly could be struck made, to kneel outside in the cold, or sent to sleep without food. And so they learned early the rules of survival. Be fast, be silent, be useful. In some households, slave children were raised alongside the master's own children, not as equals, but as shadows. They might share a space, even a toy, but the line was never blurred. The master's child gave commands. The slave child obeyed. When older, one would ride horses while the other held the reins. One learned to read while the other stirred the soup. There were rare bonds of affection between the two, especially in early years, but such closeness faded as roles became clearer. The master's child grew into authority, a slave's child into obedience. Some slave children were trained in specific skills, spinning wool, carving wood, assisting healers, or helping with livestock. If they showed talent, their owners often took interest, molding them for usefulness. A girl who embroidered well might serve the lady of the house. A boy who handled animals calmly might be taught to manage herds. But education, when it occurred, was never for the child's sake, it was for the master's benefit. There were also those selected for more personal service. Preteen girls might be trained as handmaids, their gestures molded, their voices softened, their presence designed to be pleasant and unseen. Boys might serve as runners, errand carriers, or pages in larger households. They learned how to bow properly, how to fold clothing, how to pour drinks without splashing. Their world became one of routine, predictability, and careful presence. Yet, Despite their limitations, slave children carried dreams. In the darkness, huddled under blankets too thin for the wind, they imagined rivers they'd never seen, places their parents spoke of only in whispers. They played freedom in their minds, just as others played warrior or prince. Some tried to run. Few succeeded. Those caught were punished harshly, sometimes publicly, to discourage others. And yet the thought remained. An idea passed like a spark between eyes in the kitchen or across fire pits in the fields. Maybe one day. For many, adulthood arrived quietly and without fanfare. They slid from childhood into labor, from innocence into fatigue, never marked by ceremony, only by weight. A girl who once fetched firewood was now a cook. A boy who once led goats was now harnessing oxen. Their childhood, such as it was, became a faded corner in their mind half-remembered, like a dream that slips away by morning. But memory lingered in other ways. Some slave parents taught their children the songs of their homeland, carved symbols from their lost cultures into wood or bone, or sewed tiny patterns into the hem of garments, codes of identity passed through generations. These quiet acts of legacy were their resistance, their way of saying, "We were here, and we are still here." Once in a while, a child was freed. A benevolent master, touched by loyalty or love, might grant manumission, but this was rare. More often, the child remained, grew old in the same house, and watched another generation begin the cycle anew. In the Mongol Empire, where the thunder of conquest echoed across continents, these small lives were overlooked, unrecorded. No scroll mentions their names. No monument bears their likeness. And yet they existed in laughter and labor, in bruises and bedtime stories, in dusty footprints behind the yurt. As you lie in quiet tonight, think of them not in sorrow, but in remembrance. Their dreams still drift across the steppe. Their songs still hum in the wind. Tomorrow, we will follow the thread of lineage further into relationships, courtship, and love among slaves born into this world. But for now, rest softly, knowing that even the smallest voices are never truly lost. As the evening fell across the wide Mongol steppes, and the wind softened to a whisper, the fires burned lower, not for warmth alone, but for company glowing softly within the tents and near the camps, where voices quieted and laboring hands rested. In this hush between exhaustion and sleep, where the empire itself seemed to pause its breath, hearts still dared to stir. Among the forgotten, the unseen, and the commanded, there existed another world, one of fleeting glances, gentle words, spoken beneath breath, and longing that never asked for permission. It was in this realm of silence that romance among slaves took root, not as a luxury, but as a necessity of spirit. Slaves, denied freedom in body, sought refuge in one another. Their connections were not announced with ceremony, nor recorded in scrolls, yet they were deep, resilient, and pulsing with the need to be seen, not as property, but as person. Within the long days of toil, in the shared weight of labor and hardship, souls began to align. A boy might offer a girl the first share of warm soup. A girl might tuck a woven thread into a boy's sleeve before a journey. A whispered song passed during weaving, a helping hand offered after a fall, the brushing of shoulders near the fire. All became gestures of love when language was not safe. These relationships often formed slowly, born in routine, working side by side, tending animals, gathering wood, stitching garments. They found rhythm not just in their duties, but in each other. And though they rarely spoke of love aloud, it flourished in the quiet, like moss beneath stone hidden, soft but alive. Courtship was not practiced with gifts of gold or performances of poetry. It came instead through small, persistent acts. A flower pressed into the seam of a tunic, a stone smoothed by hand and slipped into a pocket, a carved token exchanged in silence. These were their love letters, their vows, their quiet declarations. Yet every moment was marked by risk. The Mongol system allowed little room for unsanctioned connection. If two slaves were caught in a romantic bond without the knowledge or permission of their master, the consequences could be severe. Some were separated, reassigned, or punished physically. A relationship seen as disruptive to work, or simply inconvenient, could be ended at the master's whim. Despite this, slaves continued to seek one another. Love, after all, needed no permission. It existed even in fear. Some masters permitted slave unions, recognizing that a stable pairing might lead to better obedience or even children who could later serve the household. These unions, though allowed, were never fully protected. At any moment, one partner could be sold, relocated, or reassigned. Thus, slave couples learned to love with urgency, to cherish time without promise, to build lives on ground that could shift beneath them without warning. Among the most tender forms of partnership were those formed over years, where two people endured together through cold winters and harsh punishments, raising children born into the same bonds, watching one another age with the same burdens. In these long-term bonds, love became something deeper, a quiet tether of survival, a sense of home in each other when the rest of the world offered none. Even without formal marriage, some considered themselves wedded through shared scars, shared dreams, and a whispered pact spoken beside the fire. I will stay. I will return. I will not forget. Romance also brought jealousy, heartbreak, and pain. In cramped quarters, feelings flared quietly. A stolen glance from a master, a reassignment to another camp, or a rumor whispered between slaves could fracture the fragile ties. There were nights when tears fell in silence, when words of love had to be swallowed, when one was taken and the other left behind. Some reunited, most did not. But their stories were kept alive in songs sung in foreign tongues, in dreams shared, with new companions, and in the weight they carried inside, invisible to their owners, but undeniable to themselves. There were also bonds between same-sex slaves, rarely discussed, often hidden even from peers. These relationships were built on mutual need, on deep emotional companionship, and when possible, on quiet moments of touch and trust. They were perhaps even more vulnerable, but no less true. In a world where even heteronormative love was fragile, these bonds required a bravery of their own expressed only in the softest forms. Brushing hands, staying close in the cold, a shared blanket, and a whispered secret. All of these connections, whether brief or lasting, were acts of defiance. They asserted that the enslaved were still human, still capable of desire, of loyalty, of emotional truth. In loving one another, they reclaimed something that no master could fully control. They made choices, however limited. They offered parts of themselves not as obedience, but as gifts freely given. For some, love even became escape. There are whispers of slave pairs who ran together into forests, mountains, or distant lands. Few succeeded. Most were caught. But in their attempt, in their choice to risk all for the chance to be free together, they became legends among their kind. Songs were sung about them, stories told in hushed voices around the fire. They became proof that love could transcend even bondage. As the wind curls around the tents once more, and the stars shimmer with quiet approval, the memories of these hearts remain, not in royal records or carved monuments, but in the breath of the steppe, in the fire-lit faces of those who dared to love under watchful eyes. They found warmth in each other when the world turned cold. They whispered, "Stay with me," when silence was all they were allowed. And tonight, their voices linger in the dark, not bold, but real. Tomorrow, we will turn toward darker truth, how exploitation and intimacy were often intertwined, how some relationships were shaped by power rather than choice. But for now, let your heart rest gently in the knowledge that even in slavery, love bloomed. And that love, however hidden, was never small dot, as the night settles like a soft veil over the vast and breathing steppe, and the campfires dwindle to glowing embers behind the stretched hides of sleeping tents. Silence returns once more, but not all silences are peaceful. Beneath the soft murmur of wind and the rustling of woolen flaps, there lies another quiet heavier, unspoken and threaded with the discomfort of blurred lines. In the shadowy folds of the Mongol Empire, where hierarchy ruled every gesture and voice, the boundaries between intimacy and power were not always clear. For the enslaved, particularly women and young boys, closeness was often not a choice, but a command. It is here, in these hidden corners of the night, that we must pause and listen to the stories, not told in triumph, but in caution, not of love, but of ownership. In the vast camps and homes of Mongol lords, concubines were a common feature enslaved. Women taken during raids, purchased at markets, or gifted by higher-ranking patrons. To the outside world, they were companions, attendants, or caretakers. But within the thin walls of their private spaces, their role was understood. They were property, expected to provide not only labor, but physical comfort. Some were chosen for beauty, others for submission, and all were kept near their masters, sleeping in adjoining chambers or in curtained sections of the tent. They were summoned at will, no knock, no request, only the flick of a hand or a sharp word. There was no space for refusal. To say no was not an act of defiance. It was an act of danger. Consent, in the context of slavery, was an illusion, a thin curtain draped over the bare reality of domination. The enslaved learned quickly to wear calm expressions, to offer smiles that did not reach the eyes, to move gently and speak softly. These were not gestures of affection, but of survival. Some were trained, even before adolescence, to be pleasing to serve drinks, to bathe their masters, to speak with deference and charm. Their voices were shaped not by personality, but by fear. Others, less lucky, were taken without ceremony, plucked from work, stripped of dignity, and reshaped by control. In rare cases, these relationships evolved into something more layered. A concubine might bear children, manage aspects of a household, or become a trusted figure within the camp. Her master might speak to her kindly, confide in her, offer better, clothes or protection from others. But even then, the structure of ownership never dissolved. The power dynamic remained, like a blade under silk. She could be cast out, sold, replaced. Her worth was still measured, her choices still limited. Sometimes, this fragile intimacy created bonds a slave who began to care for her captor, a captor who developed emotional attachment to his servant. These tangled affections existed, but they did not erase the foundation of control. What one gave, the other could not refuse. And so, any love born of such circumstances lived under the constant shadow of imbalance. For male slaves, especially those of youth and grace, the risks were different, but no less real. In the courts of nobles or the homes of powerful women, they too were vulnerable to exploitation. Their bodies became objects of desire and their silence a requirement. A boy might be taken into the personal service of a noblewoman, not simply for errands, but for company. These situations were often cloaked in ritual massages, music, storytelling, but beneath the ritual, the reality remained. He was there because he could not leave. These relationships left marks not visible on the skin. They lingered in posture, in breath, in the way one avoided certain names or tents. Some bore it with quiet strength. Others broke slowly. And still, the empire rolled on, blind to the damage left behind its gilded drapery. Among the slaves themselves, these stories were shared in whispers, warnings passed from one to another. Guidance given to the young, quiet notes of protection. Don't look him in the eye. Avoid her tent after dark. Stay near others when the moon is high. These were not fears imagined. They were rules carved from experience. Yet, even in these dark corners, there were moments of resilience. An older slave might shield a younger one. A group might watch out for each other. Small acts of resistance, refusing to smile, delaying when called, muttering prayers under breath, were ways of saying, "You may have my body, but not my spirit." And sometimes, in the rarest of circumstances, a master changed. Guilt stirred. Kindness surfaced. A slave was released, a concubine freed. But these were stories passed like myths too rare to shape hope, too fragile to trust. The Mongol Empire, for all its strategies and sophistication, made no law to protect the intimacy of the enslaved. No council met to discuss consent. No scroll forbade the claiming of a body by its owner. And so, the enslaved lived between lines not drawn by ink, but by glances, orders, and expectations. As you breathe softly now, and your thoughts drift, like smoke rising above the campfires, know that these stories, though difficult, deserve remembrance. Not for sorrow alone, but for recognition. Tomorrow, we will explore healing, how some slaves found strength through herbal knowledge, how they became caretakers not only of themselves, but of others. But tonight, allow stillness. Let your breath slow and your body rest. You are far from the noise now. And in this silence, even the stories shaped by power are given space to be heard with compassion, with honesty, and with care. As the long night deepened over the sleeping steppe, and the hush of distant wolves gave way to the low breathing of tents filled with weary bodies, another kind of stillness took hold, a quieter presence, softer than the clatter of hooves or the crackle of fire. It was the calm that followed healing, the silence that came after pain was eased. In the great web of the Mongol Empire, among warriors and rulers, traders and messengers, there lived another kind of servant, not one who carried weapons, nor tended fires, but one who brought comfort with her hands and knowledge with her breath. These were the slaves who healed. Women and men, often taken from distant lands, who carried in their memories the wisdom of plants, the rhythm of childbirth, and the rituals of care passed down through generations. Though their chains held tight, their minds held older truths of leaves that soothed fever, of teas that calmed tremors, of touch that softened grief. They were not called doctors. They had no scrolls, no titles. But in the darkest hours, when blood flowed or lungs burned, or a child's cry broke the night, it was they who were summoned, not with honor, but with urgency. Among them were herbalists, those who could walk the steppe and name each plant. By feel, who knew which roots dulled pain and which berries must be avoided. These slaves often worked alone, venturing into hills at dawn to gather, returning with baskets of green and brown, scents of earth and bloom clinging to their robes. They dried their findings near cooking fires, ground powders with stones, boiled leaves in thick-walled pots, until the air grew heavy with bittersweet vapor. They made poultices for burns, infusions for fever, salves for cracked skin. Some treated infected wounds using mold from bread or crushed garlic, long before such practices were written down. They kept their knowledge secret, passed only to trusted others. It was power, and in slavery, power was dangerous. Some were midwives, trained not by formal schools, but by years of steady hands and countless births. These women, often older, slaves, were keepers of life in its first moments. They were called upon when the master's wife labored, when a concubine cried out, when another slave bent under the weight of a child soon to be born. They arrived with bundles of cloth, carved bone tools, and a calmness earned from experience. They knew how to turn a breech baby, how to coax breath into a silent newborn, how to stop a mother's bleeding with herbs and pressure. Their presence was revered in the moment, yet forgotten once the child cried and the danger passed. Their reward was often no more than a piece of warm bread or a nod of thanks. And yet they returned each time, because they knew the pain and because no one else would come. Caretakers were another quiet thread slaves assigned to the sick, the old or the injured. These were the ones who stayed up through the night, wiping brows, spooning broth into parched mouths, changing bandages, and singing lullabies in languages long forgotten by their masters. They comforted not only with herbs or cloth, but with presence, with the patience to hold a hand when the rest of the world turned away. Often, these caretakers formed bonds with those they served. An old master softened in sickness. A child looked only to the caretaker for comfort. And sometimes, in their most vulnerable state, even the powerful recognized the humanity of the one kneeling beside them. But once health returned, the wall rose again. The servant was servant once more. Among slave communities themselves, these healers were even more vital. With no access to formal doctors or medicine, they became the first and last hope. They treated injured fingers cut from work, sores from tight ropes, coughs from cold tents. They stitched wounds with horsehair, bathed fevers with wet cloth, used smoke from burning herbs to clear infections. They knew where to press, when to whisper, and when to pray. They were respected, often protected, sometimes even hidden from new owners to avoid separation. It was not rare for slaves to barter with food or favors for a healer's care. These slaves did more than mend bodies, they preserved spirit. When someone could not sleep, they brewed calming teas. When nightmares lingered, they offered talismans made of herbs and string. When someone grieved, they sat quietly, humming lullabies from lost homes. In a world built on command, these small gestures were the closest thing to freedom they could give one another. Of course, not all masters respected this gift. Some saw it only as utility, another skill to be exploited. A healer might be summoned to a neighboring camp, sent alone in the dark with threats of punishment if she failed. Others were overworked, expected to care for dozens with no rest, no food, no support. A few were accused of sorcery if a treatment failed. And yet they endured, because to heal was also to resist, to keep life moving when the empire itself fed on exhaustion. The knowledge they carried, passed from one generation of slaves to the next, became a legacy no master could erase. A girl who watched her grandmother mix herbs learned which flowers eased pain. A boy who helped his mother wash wounds grew to become the caretaker of his own peers. Their traditions flowed like a hidden stream beneath the surface of the empire, feeding strength where the world expected only weakness. At night, after tending to others, these slaves often sat quietly, staring into fire. Their hands, tired and stained, rested briefly. And in that stillness, they remembered those they had saved, those they had lost, and those they still hoped to help. No scroll bore their names. No statue marked their deeds. But their legacy was written in healed bodies, in soothed tears, in children born alive. As you drift into sleep now, feel the warmth of those gentle hands moving across time. And space not to command, not to control, but to care. Let your breath slow, like the steeping of herbs in a quiet tent. Let your thoughts soften, like the wrapping of cloth around a wound. You are safe now. You are remembered. Tomorrow, we will follow their footsteps into the world of slave run. Communities, spaces of gathering, memory, and quiet unity. But for now, rest. The hands that heal are watching over you. As dusk swept gently over the steppes, and the golden light slipped into shadows across the hills. A quieter world stirred to life beneath the vast sky. The horses were fed, the fires banked, and the masters' voices had grown still. But behind the tents, beyond the ring of the command posts, and at the edges of markets and military camps, another kind of settlement took shape, not of formal structure or declared freedom, but of quiet understanding. Here, within earthen huts, in makeshift lean-tos beside yurts, or gathered near hidden fires, slaves found one another, not merely as fellow laborers, but as something more essential, as a community. In the Mongol Empire, where the might of Vai, warriors thundered across continents and rulers reshaped landscapes with a wave of the hand. The world of slaves existed parallel, unacknowledged by scrolls, undocumented in edicts, and invisible to the elite. Yet within this world, the enslaved carved out spaces where memory, kinship, and survival wove themselves into something enduring. These communities were not born of freedom, but of necessity. Slaves often came from different tribes, nations, and languages. Some spoke Turkish, others Chinese, some Persian or Russian. Yet over time, a shared tongue evolved among them, born of gesture, common words, and shared labor. In these evolving dialects, they whispered stories of home, taught each other songs, and created a patchwork culture of resilience. In large encampments, slaves would gather in the quiet hours early morning before commands rang out or late. At night, when footsteps faded, they shared meals of coarse millet, sour milk, boiled roots, or stale flatbread. If one had more salt, another would bring firewood. If someone's child was sick, another would stay late to help. It was not charity, it was survival. In these gatherings, laughter flickered like firelight. Someone might mimic a master's strut. Another would tell a story about a goat that outran 3 soldiers, and yet another might sing a lullaby from their grandmother's village. These moments were precious brief bursts of humanity in a world that tried to erase it. They did not undo the hardship, but they softened it. Rituals formed within these slave communities, though never formally recorded. There were shared commemorations, quiet moments when someone died, marked by a rock placed near a tree or a small braid tied to a fence post. When a child was born, women gathered to whisper blessings, drawing symbols in the dirt. If someone ran away, their name was spoken with both fear and awe, and their absence was honored with silence. Bonds formed between slaves were stronger than circumstance. 2 men might consider each other brothers, even if from opposite corners of the empire. A group of women might call themselves mothers to each other's children. Elderly slaves, often no longer fit for work, became storytellers and memory keepers. They told tales from lost cities, explained the stars, passed down advice, and stitched together identity from the scattered pieces of exile. Within the limited autonomy allowed to them, slaves developed systems of mutual support. Someone who knew how to patch boots would fix others. A woman skilled in weaving would teach the young girls. A man good with animals might train children in how to move quietly near nervous horses. Knowledge flowed sideways, peer to peer, not as property of the masters, but as a collective inheritance that belonged to none and all. Even punishment was shared. If one slave was whipped unjustly, others would band together to finish that person's work. If someone was accused, the group would defend them, quietly offering alibis, hiding tools, delaying tasks to cover the absence. In the face of violence, their unity was armor. There were unspoken rules. Don't steal from each other. Watch the children. Share when you can. If someone cries, let them. If someone forgets their old name, remind them. These codes were never carved in stone, yet they endured like gospel written in behavior, in kindness, in memory. When love blossomed between slaves, the community noticed. Gifts were exchanged not with gold, but with help, a warm fur from an older woman, advice from a wise man, a corner of the tent offered for privacy. When 2 slaves united in affection, the community celebrated quietly, perhaps with a shared meal. or whispered song. And when the same bond broke, they consoled each other without judgment. Some communities were large, found near military camps or imperial roads. Others were small, just a handful of people bonded by circumstance. In either case, they offered each other a sense of identity that their owners never could. In the eyes of their masters, they were tools. But among themselves, they were sons, daughters, sisters, poets, dancers, believers. And it was in this distinction that their strength lay. Even the children of slaves felt this community pulse around them. They were rocked to sleep by many arms, corrected by many voices, praised by many eyes. They belonged even when their lineage was unknown. They learned the stories of their people through fire-lit tailies, inherited songs, and shared prayers spoken in broken tongues. The masters never noticed. Or perhaps they did, but didn't understand. They thought of slaves as disconnected, as obedient individuals too scattered to organize. But they were wrong. For the enslaved, community was not rebellion, it was endurance. And that endurance was quiet, patient, and powerful. These small pockets of humanity stretched across the empire like stars, each one isolated, yet connected by the same night sky. When one burned out, another lit up elsewhere. And so they survived, not alone, but together. As your eyes grow heavy now, and your breath steadies with the night, let yourself imagine one such fire-low, quiet, warm. Around it sit figures with tired hands and strong eyes. They are not free, but they are not broken. They pass bread. They hum. They laugh softly. In their silence, they speak everything. Tomorrow, we will explore the homes they built, the architecture of slave quarters, the design of space within constraint. But for now, sleep beside their fire. You are not alone. You are among them in warmth, in memory, and in peace. As night laid its cool hand across the grasslands of the Mongol Empire, and the last murmurs of command faded into hush, small lights continued to flicker in corners beyond the noble yurts and command tents. These were not fires of feast or celebration, but of necessity smaller, humbler, yet glowing with the quiet warmth of shelter. Behind the scenes of empire, beneath the banners of conquest, and beneath the hoofbeats of victory, lay the unnoticed homes of the enslaved. In the shadows of the master's camp, or on the edge of noble estates, the slaves carved out places to rest their weary bodies, to breathe, and to remember themselves. These spaces, though rarely acknowledged in chronicles, were where the soul of the enslaved dwelled not in defiance, but in quiet continuity. A slave's living space was rarely permanent. The Mongol Empire's fluid mobility meant that homes often shifted with the seasons, the campaigns, or the will of the owners. For those who traveled with armies, a slave's home was often a small tent pitched at the outskirts of the main encampment, constructed from whatever could be found: stitched hide, discarded fabric, woven reeds, old saddlecloths. It offered no privacy, little protection from the wind, and none from the orders that might come at any hour. Yet it was something. A place to lie down, a place to sigh. Inside these makeshift tents, space was minimal and shared. Sometimes 5 or 6 bodies crammed into a single space no larger than a wagon. Blankets were rare if not shared or scavenged, and clothing doubled as bedding. The floor was packed earth, sometimes softened with straw or dry grass if it could be found. There was no furniture. Instead, personal items, few and often broken, were kept in cloth bundles or small sacks. A wooden comb, a piece of bone carved with markings, a worn scrap of cloth from home. These tokens, though trivial in value, carried entire lifetimes. For slaves attached to noble households, especially in more settled areas, quarters were sometimes fixed mud brick huts in the rear of larger compounds, or lean-tos built against storage sheds. These spaces were windowless, cramped, and often shared by multiple families. Smoke from cooking fires clung to the low ceilings. Air was thick and still. Yet even in these tight quarters, signs of life emerged. Mats woven from reeds were laid neatly. Tiny hearths were built from stones. Walls were sometimes etched with designs lines meant to resemble rivers, suns drawn like the ones remembered from a faraway home. In rare cases, permission was granted for slave families to build their own shelters. These small dwellings, while still under control of the master, gave room for personalization. A painted bowl placed carefully near the door, a wind chime made from bone fragments, a child's name scratched into the wooden frame of the entrance. These were the quiet defiance of those not allowed to own anything, yet still daring to leave a mark. During winter, when temperatures dropped and snow blanketed the steppes, slave shelters became places of struggle. Fires were maintained through shared effort dung, and dry brush collected daily, small fires built close to the ground. Blankets were layered, bodies huddled together, warmth shared without question. If one had an extra scarf, it was passed. If someone had saved fat from cooking, it was melted and mixed into broth for the week. Survival was communal. Summer brought different challenges. Tents became stifling under the midday sun. Insects swarmed. Dust crept into every fold. Yet even then, the same rhythms held. At night, people gathered in doorways. Children chased fireflies near the fence posts. Elders fanned themselves with woven mats. And all the while, the silence of constraint hung in the air. But these spaces bare, modest, and easily overlooked were more than shelter. They were the thresholds of humanity. Within them, slaves wept after punishment, sang lullabies. To children, whispered old prayers, and dreamt silently of another life. They sewed clothing, prepared food, taught words to young ones. They braided each other's hair. They held hands when fear gripped the night. They laughed, softly and carefully, but truly. Not every living space was equal. Slaves who served closely to masters sometimes slept indoors in storage rooms, kitchens, or just outside the master's chambers. These spaces offered warmth and sometimes security, but they came with watchful eyes, with demands at all hours, and with little distance from control. The paradox of proximity, closer to power, yet farther from rest. Some slaves created secret spaces in the woods, behind stables, near riverbanks. Places where they could sit alone, even briefly. Places to talk without listening ears. Some built shrines from sticks and stones to gods they could no longer name. Others carved patterns into the earth, a kind of writing known only to them. These were not just spaces, they were sanctuaries. And so, every slave dwelling, no matter how small, became a canvas of memory and will. Over time, traditions developed. A smooth stone was placed outside the door of a shelter when someone was ill. A braid was hung beside the entrance for protection. Stories were told in specific corners. Names of lost loved ones were whispered before sleep. If a member of the household died, their space was left untouched for 3 nights, and others lit a small lamp nearby, if they could. These were not rules laid down by masters, but by the slaves themselves. In a world where nothing belonged to them, they still created ritual. Even joy found room. During rare moments of celebration, births, escapes, victories in whispered stories, would clean their spaces, share dried fruits, sing in hushed tones. They lit extra lamps. Some drew marks on their doorposts, using ash or berry juice. These were their festivals, not marked by drums or banners, but by remembrance. As your eyes now grow heavy and your mind begins to drift, picture one such home. A tiny tent lit by a dying ember, the wind whispering through its flaps. Inside, a child sleeps beside their mother, two others curled near a mat. The father, just returned from tending livestock, strokes the child's hair once before laying down. No one speaks. Yet in that silence lives something more permanent than stone presence. Tomorrow we shall walk with them beyond their shelters to the marketplaces, to the places where slaves moved among merchants, trading what little they had. But for now, rest within their shelter. You are welcome here. You are warm here. You are safe in this tent of memory and humanity. As dawn crept gently across the grassy expanses of the Mongol Empire, and early morning mist clung to the lowlands. Like breath on a cold mirror, the market stirred with the quiet energy of preparation. The air was tinged with the scent of dust, spices, and boiled milk. Traders began unpacking goods from saddlebags. Tents rose along the sides of beaten tracks, and stalls formed in open spaces between military camps and riverbanks. These were not permanent cities, but seasonal lungs of commerce expanding, contracting, breathing in goods from every corner of the empire. And within this ebb and flow moved the quietest current of all, the slaves. Their feet trod the paths first, carrying crates of dried meat, bundles of felt, sacks of barley, jars of honey. They arrived before the sun was high and left long after. The last horse galloped out. They were not merchants by name. Their hands held no coin. But in the great invisible machinery of Mongol trade, they were the gears, always turning. Slaves served every facet of the trade system. In caravans, they loaded and unloaded camels, managed tents, cooked meals, and sometimes walked entire routes on foot while their masters rode. At market stalls, they laid out wares, polished metal goods, and stacked pottery with the careful touch of someone who knew what even a single broken item could cost. They tended to the beasts that carried silk from China, glass from Persia, wool from Central Asia, and furs from the north. Some were tasked with watching goods overnight, sleeping lightly, ready to rise at the sound of rustling cloth or snapping. Rope, a few, especially trusted ones, acted as runners delivering messages between merchants, retrieving forgotten items, or collecting ingredients for medicines being sold. These tasks made them invisible and yet omnipresent, always on the edge of the transaction, but never the one speaking. And yet, many of these slaves understood the trades better than the merchants themselves. They knew the weight of spices by feel, the scent of real musk from the fake, the proper tension of a bowstring. Though they were rarely asked their opinions, they often whispered advice to young masters, reminded buyers of price trends, or caught signs of cheating in an exchange. Older slaves, especially those kept in merchant families for decades, became walking ledgers holding in memory the value of wool in winter, the rise of salt prices near rivers, the preferred cuts of leather in various tribes. But their wisdom lived in silence. In certain border markets, slaves were even used as live demonstrations. A master might present a slave's handiwork woven textiles, sculpted wood, carefully dyed fabric, and have the slave sit beside the item as proof of authenticity. She did this, the merchant would say, pointing without introduction. The woman might not speak, but she would smile, lift the cloth, show its stitching. It was advertisement wrapped in ownership. Slaves also facilitated translation. Mongol Empire was vast, and traders from Samarkand, Baghdad, Delhi, and Kaifeng might gather in a single camp. Multilingual slaves, those taken from crossroads or raised among traders, became invaluable. They whispered phrases in Chinese, clarified costs in Persian, and bartered prices in Turkic tongues. Their mouths moved not for themselves, but for the benefit of others. At the end of each transaction, they stood back, unnoticed, but remembered by both sides. In some markets, slaves were themselves the commodity. Auctions were held quietly behind tents, or openly in the main square, depending on the region. A group of chained individuals would be displayed, their attributes spoken like livestock: strong back, knows 2 languages, midwife. Men, women, children, each labeled with purpose, reduced to function. These scenes unfolded under the same sun that lit trade in ivory and tea. Buyers inspected teeth, asked them to walk, probed their hands for calluses. The same hands that once rocked cradles or carved art were now measured for endurance. But trade was not only done through selling bodies, it also moved through the bodies of slaves. They were often the ones tasked with long-distance delivery. A master might send his slave with letters and goods across great stretches, trusting that his markings or seals would protect them. The slaves traveled light, often alone, sleeping near road shrines, depending on their reputation, wits, and knowledge of local dialects to survive. Some became known to innkeepers, stable hands, and fellow travelers. They were part of a silent network: one nod here, a piece of bread there, a shelter found through recognition, not rank. Among themselves, slaves formed a separate market of exchange. They bartered skills mending a robe, in return for a carved spoon, teaching songs in exchange for berries or herbs. These transactions did not require coin. They relied on memory, trust, and repetition. Some even managed to store tiny savings, kept in bits of cloth hidden in seams, to buy small trinkets for loved ones, or bribe a guard for leniency. And yet, despite their knowledge and labor, few slaves ever escaped their economic place. Ownership followed them like a brand. No matter how wise the suggestion, the final word was never theirs. No matter how precise their hand, the signature belonged to someone else. No matter how far they carried the trade, their journey remained someone else's profit. Even so, they shaped the market in invisible ways. When a certain herb arrived on time, it was because a slave remembered the path. When a precious vase remained intact, it was because a slave had wrapped it with his own scarf. When goods were counted, when wagons were balanced, when animals remained calm in storm, it was because the slaves saw what the masters overlooked. And in this way, they left fingerprints on every trade, route soft and unseen, but enduring. As you sink into rest now, let your thoughts wander through the echoing footsteps of those ancient markets. Hear the hush of quiet barter, the rustle of cloth, the creak of ropes drawn tight. Know that even in the vast machinery of commerce, it was often the quietest hands that held everything in balance. Tomorrow, we will follow those same footsteps toward the end of this journey into the final chapter of this story, where we explore the legacies left behind. But for now, let your breath slow like the closing of a market at twilight. You are drifting through memory. You are safe in silence. As the final twilight settled over the endless steps and the wind carried with it the whispers of untold years. A soft stillness fell across the great Mongol lands, a stillness not of silence, but of memory. The empire, once a living beast of conquest, speed, and transformation, had slowly sunk into the dust of history. Its khans and courts, its roads and yurts, its banners and edicts faded into parchment and ruin. And yet, woven within its very foundation, invisible to the scrolls and absent from the thrones, were the slaves. Their voices never inscribed, their faces rarely painted, their names long lost to the winds, but their presence, their labor, their sacrifice, their endurance remained. Even now, centuries beyond their breath, echoes of their lives persist. In every city that was once a tent, in every canal dug through frozen soil, in every fortress wall pressed with handmade brick there, lies the imprint of enslaved hands. Their legacy is not one of war, but of survival, not of dominion, but of daily persistence. And it is here, in the margins, that history breathes its most honest sigh. In the Mongol Empire, slavery was not an afterthought, it was a structure. It fed the armies, clothed the court, birthed the next generation of warriors and scholars alike. Slaves were scribes, cooks, caretakers, concubines, stablemen, translators, and healers. They spoke in dozens of tongues, dreamed of homelands scattered across mountains and coasts, and learned to navigate the maze of empire without leaving a trace. Though they were owned, their humanity resisted definition. They formed families, without names, bonds without papers, and memories that lived longer than the ones who claimed to possess them. Over time, some were freed, offered release for loyalty or labor, permitted to buy their way out, or simply forgotten and left behind. These freed slaves, often called Korashu in Mongol society, became artisans, minor officials, or wanderers. Some integrated into Mongol society, their children rising as soldiers or servants again, their grandchildren unaware of the chains once worn. Others fled into anonymity, settling in quiet villages, carving lives from land they could call their own. But not all could escape. Many died in obscurity, unnamed and unburied, their lives buried beneath shifting grass and collapsing camps. And yet, despite all the hardship, what the enslaved left behind was not only struggle, it was also culture. Songs sung in secret became folk tunes of future generations. Weaving patterns taught among the tents now appear in distant tribal fabrics. Herbs used for healing were passed from midwife to midwife, surviving long after the hands that first ground them to powder had returned to earth. Even myths evolved, stories of nameless heroes who endured, of lovers separated by raids, of healers who saved lives in silence. These weren't just tales, they were coded memories, preserved against erasure. In the ruins of Karakoram, the once great capital, archaeologists uncover tools, pottery, and remnants of daily life. Some of these objects show signs of care-etched initials, careful repairs, symbols not found in official Mongol script. These are not the marks of royalty. These are the quiet legacies of slaves. For every empire that rose through force there, existed another that rose through persistence. And in the Mongol Empire, that second empire, the empire of the enslaved, was built in silence. It had no Khan, no court, no decree. But it endured longer than battles and held more meaning than maps. It was passed through the beating heart, the curled palm, the soft lullaby hummed to a sleeping child. Over time, the descendants of slaves scattered. Some became part of settled Central Asian communities. Others moved along the trade routes. Their ancestors once walked, now free to choose direction. In small towns and far villages, traditions lingered, ways of cooking, of storytelling, of mourning. These were not remembered as slave customs, but simply as life. The source forgotten, the echo remained. Historians today struggle to uncover the full extent of Mongol slave society. The records were not written for them, but in the silences, between the lines, in the inventories of livestock and property, in the names that appear once and never again, their shadows rise. Through DNA, through folklore, through comparative traditions, the puzzle is slowly taking shape. And in that slow reconstruction, dignity is restored, not granted, but recognized. As you breathe slowly now, lying beneath your own sky, far from the endless steppe and the burdened tents of history, let your mind rest among these forgotten souls. Let yourself feel the weight of their journeys, their stolen homes, their quiet triumphs. You are part of their memory simply by remembering. And in that remembering, they live on not in chains, but in story. Not in silence, but in echo. Tomorrow will come with new tales, but tonight we have reached the end of this path. The fire has burned low. The tent is quiet. The stars above shimmer gently, just as they did above the camps of the enslaved. They shine for all equally. The empire sleeps. The chains are gone, but the people remain etched into time, Quiet as breath, strong as earth. Earth.